My name is Helen Molesworth. For those of you who have stuck with us all day, you get some kind of amazing prize. And for those of you who are just coming in, you get the same prize. And that prize is what I'm billing as a State of the Union, a conversation with the esteemed writer and critic Peter Schjeldahl about where we are at this particular moment in the art world. Everyone in the art world has been reading Peter for years, no matter when you entered the art world, whether you entered the art world in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, or just yesterday, you've probably brushed up against the criticism and the abiding intelligence of Peter Schjeldahl as someone who looks at art, thinks about it, and then really, what can I say, Peter, you turn a phrase. You've got a lot of words at your fingertips, and you also have a lot of pictures in your head. So it's just such a pleasure to have you here today, and to kind of worm our way out of the pandemic together.
Well, yes, I'm very pleased to be here today, and with you especially. But for me to be posed as a current expert on the state of art is rather forcing it. My wife and I have spent the last 15 months in a house in the Catskills because at the end of 2019, two things happened. I was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, and there was a fire in our building which destroyed our apartment. The diagnosis seemed premature. I'm healthy now, old but healthy, and the apartment, the renovation is dragging on. But it's been hard not having a place to stay in the city, so I've kept up as I could. And being back, I mean, it's just having now been a couple of days in the city. Just anthropologically, it's a different. It's a revelation. I mean, well, and Chelsea, by the way, I've been watching people. Everybody is young, slim, and has at least one dog. And I don't know. I asked Helen if I could start with something a little bit frivolous.
Go for it.
It just happened. I just read this poem, which is by Edward Arlington Robinson, the early 20th century poet who I think is very much underrated. And by the way, I've heard that he's Jasper Johns' favorite poet.
He's Jasper Johns' favorite poet, okay.
And here's the poem. And also it kind of sets the mood, it kind of reveals
the state of your being
the state
at the
of
moment.
mind.
Okay.
He must have had a father and a mother. In fact, I've heard him say so. And a dog, as the boy should, I venture. And the dog, most likely, he was the only man who knew him. A dog, for all I know, is what he needs as much as anything right here today, to console him about his disillusions, old aches, and parturitions of what's coming. A dog of orders, an emeritus, to wag his tail at him when he comes home, and then to put his paws up on his knees and say, "For God's sake, what's it all about?"
I feel like in this poem, I'm the dog. Like, Peter, what's it all about?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the structural situation of the art world is kind of cryogenically, preserved from before the pandemic. The booming commercial system with its gallery wings and its finance wings,
right,
and then institutions, which I think have had at the time of the pandemic, we're doing a lot of sort of purposeful things, political and other, and what their function is now is something that you will certainly know more about than me. But what how is all this going to work, and who's interested?
Right. I think those are exactly the kinds of questions I hope we can get into a little bit. Before we dive right into the stuff that's so sticky, though, I'd love to know from you a couple of things. It's a corny question, but it's heartfelt. What did you miss the most? Or how did you feel the shutdown and the isolation when it came to not looking at art? What happened?
It's like I was decapitated. I mean, my body, lost any function.
Right.
And the bombardment. I hope, by the way, that a long-term aspect of this last year has been a fairly widespread level of loathing and disgust with digital images. As if they're actual information, as if they're actual experience, as if they get you anywhere, Yesterday, I had the privilege of being with Helen and Brooke, my wife, and her friend Jared Ernest at the Frick Madison, which it was the first time I was able to see it. And those are like actual objects made of stuff hanging on the wall in favorable light, and it's just so profoundly exciting. And again, it is like being returned to your body, where it isn't just your eyes and your head. It isn't just information. It isn't just knowledge. It's experience that involves your heart and your gut and then your sex.
Yep.
And that you're sharing the world with these things.
I found, because it was amazing to be at the Frick at the Breuer yesterday with you, how all of us who've grown up in that museum, going to see those pictures regularly, as we know that collection doesn't move a lot, we know those pictures really well. All of us were encountering things we had never seen before.
Yeah.
And I don't have that same response to a digital image. I'm in total control.
And the Bellini,
the Stigmata of St. Francis Bellini.
It's like, I finally saw the rabbit that people have talked about.
Right.
There's a rabbit sticking its head out of the hole in the wall with it. Frankly, goofy expression.
And it's a very goofy rabbit, too.
Yeah.
I mean, its eyes are it's a really wall-eyed, almost cartoonish rabbit.
But then there's my favorite detail is the donkey.
Right.
You're sitting there, placid, lovely, without a thought in its head, completely. There's nothing that's not escaping this guy.
You told me that was your favorite, and of course, I was drawn to the crane right next to it, which I think is my own sense of, I run a little anxious. I'm always trying to make sure I see everything, in the crane there, all tense and, trying on that little precipice, looking in the same direction as St. Francis. I had never...
It's such an incredible painting. It is all of this detail, which is all simultaneous.
Right.
But there's no some conclusion to it. I mean, he's got his hands out. He did not.
Right.
You don't see the stigmata, where there's usually an angel beaming down from the sky. There's a tree that's leaning over and looks a little bit interested in things. But,
right. And for those folks who haven't yet had the opportunity to go to the Frick and see, or go to the Breuer building and see the Frick pictures, the St. Francis is in a room by itself with one of those amazing trapezoidal windows. And so that gesture of St. Francis, he's oriented directly to.
It is darn clever. The whole installation is so beautifully thought through.
Right.
But I don't know, and I don't want to dwell on it too much, but, there was a shock of happy shot of recognition of the physicality of art that's made of stuff the way we're made of stuff.
Right. And the way we're made of stuff makes us kind of sticky and obdurate, and the objects were a bit sticky and obdurate too.
Yeah, no, it's not. No, it's not easy. But once you start looking at these things, it can be hard to stop.
What was your takeaway now that you've been able to sleep on the experience of looking at those paintings, old master paintings we know very well that are traditionally in this highly domestic, orchestrated, almost stage set, and to have them in that modernist interior?
Meat racks, like about. That's actually one of the things I love about the Frick is that everything is warm.
Yep.
It's all. Whereas, the big museums like the Metropolitan, everything's cold. I mean, everything's there because of the consensus of committees over the decades. And so you walk in and you have to choose something to look at, and you've got to warm it up yourself, But the Frick is, and it carries over to this incredible installation. It's just cooking when you walk in, bam, here or there.
Right. Did you miss the domestic warmth, or did you like that kind of the shock of seeing them that way?
Mansion. I love that as an artifact of it's a kind of a three-dimensional snapshot of the artistic and domestic and social and money bags, sensibility of the time.
Right.
The Fragonard room. Anyway, the Fragonards look incredible at Madison Avenue. I mean, that was where the ladies went after dinner.
Right.
To have tea. The men went in the basement with their cigars. There's a pool table and two bowling alleys down there. And I got to bowl the fine once. Not very well.
When we were there, one of the things you said, and it's of course so true about the Frick collection, is that, there are some pictures that aren't as good as other pictures, but there is a bar that gets set, right?
It was put together, and the Frick collection has no depth. Right. There's nothing second rate.
Right. There's no bench.
There's a cream.
Right.
At a time when through Lord Devine and other dealers realized an historical opportunity that the Europe was full of art and was broke. Okay. They were in steep depression. And America was full of money and didn't have much art, so basically they sent ships back and forth, and that's a great collection at the National Gallery in Washington. All come from that.
Do you think?
But also, I think the point we were getting at, which I don't want to belabor too much, but it's like I was thinking about the one value about art that you don't hear talked about very much anymore is quality.
Right.
Quality. Good, better, best.
Right.
We're and that's naturally human. We have that feeling about sports, about food, about we're not shy about judging good, better, best. And we might, and maybe we don't have time to go into the history of how that became disapproved in our circles. I think partly it had to do with the evil influence of Clement Greenberg, who pushed it. And I remember at the time thinking, quality, the way he used it, had its social snobbery thing. It's like the rich and cultivated used to be called the quality.
Right.
And it would seem like sort of snob advertising. But the fact is, some things are better than other things, and some things are fucking incredible.
Right.
Right. The Rembrandt and the Velasquez and
Right.
Cipollini.
And the Ang.
Yeah. And the Yang, which is, well,
Ang.
You can think and talk about that thing forever.
That Ang is just spectacular.
Why
do you think we got so skittish, though, about good, better, and best and the ultimate fucking amazing?
Yeah.
Why do you think the art world got so skittish about it?
I think it had to do with the social formation. I mean, I think it was a turn against settled snobbery and doctrinaire formalism, and and it was the '60s, for heaven's sakes.
Right.
It was like, show me something that's sitting on top of something else, and I'm going to knock it off.
Right. Right.
And there was an anarchism, and that democracy is a good word for it, and I lived through it. I've lived through a lot of whipsaws, but it was. There have been moments when of artists. I was thinking about Susan Rothenberg, and then not to mention Gerhard Richter or Sigmar Polke, where some artist just kind of crashes into the situation, but is not valued or described as better, but just as something you got to deal with. You can't.
Right.
Okay.
I have this. I don't even remember anymore where I read this, and it might be an apocryphal story, but I want to share it with you and see what your response is. So it's a party scene sometime in the 70s, and someone apparently walks up to David Anton, the poet,
Yeah.
and says, "How are you doing? What's going on?" And he says, "I am just waiting for minimalism to die." Which is a great line to say at a party, but I want to ask you...
It kind of did, but he definitely did. So,
But I want to ask you, do you think that this current efflorescence of painting, of figurative painting, of work that taps into things that are more about emotions and feelings and less about form, do you see this shift as being partly bound up with a kind of the ebbing away of minimalism's hold on us?
Yeah, that would be accurate. Minimalism never went away.
Right.
It was really a revolution. It was a change in the scale and the relation of what we think of as art to institutions, to public space.
Right.
Anti-sentimental, it was really hell on the poor last generation abstract expressionists.
Right. Well, it's like every kind of negation, minimalism, right? Like no feeling, no sentiment, no figure.
But it also had to do with a social change. It had to do with an architectural change. Mm-hmm. It had to do with big spaces.
Like this one, yeah.
I remember what used to be thought of as big spaces in the 60s, and practically closets, like Leo Castelli on 77th Street. But, plazas, airports, shopping malls, highways, and also the sort of captive audience of an aspiring new, upper bourgeois, collector class, who at first they were doctors and lawyers,
right, right,
and they passed for being rich. It was a huge change, and I think any artist since then has had to deal with it on some level. Mm-hmm. It's like Like you do a figurative painting and put a frame around it, you're saying, okay, I'm not dealing with that shit. But
Right.
it because it has takes on a certain drama and not
Right.
being minimal.
Right.
Uh,
And I wonder if you've been such an astute observer of objects and their surroundings. And you just sort of made the allusion to the doctors and lawyers that once formed the collector class. And I entered in, I think, right at the tail end of that. My first job, there were a lot of doctors and lawyers. My last job, no doctors and lawyers.
now they're moguls. I mean,
Right.
they're people who have way too much money, and the fact that they have way too much money is lends a certain frivolity to the market.
Right.
It's like, I mean, their art holdings could, crash in value overnight, and would their accountant even notice? So there's that, which, I really don't like for,
Right.
little changes.
Do you think that frivolity is maybe bound up a little bit to the loosening of the good, better, best conversation?
Well, sure. It's well, I guess it's a kind of sublimation of it, and we're hotter, hottest,
Right.
right. Which may or may not loosely accord with the quality of the work,
Right.
but see, the old notion that it was going to take some time for things to sort out. There seems to have been 86. I mean, that's
Right.
But that's the commercial side, and the institutional side, which has been doing a number of good things, and it's getting caught. By the way, we haven't mentioned political art, or art that's involved with social justice, which is like. To me, it's like a slightly. I mean, there's a good, better, best about it too.
Right.
But it's essentially art that's for something.
Right.
It's like art being used as an implement to make changes in the world, not just in other art. And we'll have to see what level and intensity that maintains. But it's like, I mean, I guess I am old-fashioned. I mean, it's like trying to make a good work of art and trying to change the world, to me, are inimical things. I mean,
Yeah, and you find it hard to keep those two things together.
you can't really. You can't really, because you're because you're going to make some of your decisions based on what seems true and just and politically
Right.
effective, and while you're trying to make decisions based on what something looks like,
Right.
I'm not.
I have this just wild sense of belief in great art objects to do a kind of political work, whether they intend to do it or not. It's part of my belief in them as ethical offerings from one human being to another.
Well, that's beautiful, and I think all art is political. I mean, every damn thing in the world is political if you look at it that way.
Absolutely.
But then, of course, there was the era of Freud, where everything in the world was sexual and looked like it. You take a quality and apply it, and you can blank it.
Right.
And it's like, what we're looking at the Frick is the now sort of ghostly constituency of people, which were us, I think, as we were looking, of the purely disinterested, that is, we didn't talk about the politics of some of the work, but it's like, as a way of getting to know more about them, but it's like, they blew us away.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
And that's, and to be someone who lives with that value of being blown away doesn't make you reactionary. It doesn't make you anything.
Right. Well, if anything, it might. I mean, it was actually amazing to be in the Frick with you and to see you still have the capacity to be blown away and to see the pictures still having the capacity to blow you away.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I thought this moment.
Well, they were given, I mean, the installation is really incredible. I mean, it's like every picture there is given a shot.
Yeah.
It's like it's set up beautifully, so it's just like, it'll never look better.
That's so interesting that every picture is given a shot, because that's a kind of democratic value, right? That in a meritocracy.
That's interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought through that. I mean, the sort of social implications of what the Frick has done.
Right.
With that. I mean, everything's going to go back to that.
Right, everything's going to go back into its place, and those rooms have a hierarchy unto themselves, as any domestic space where those rooms have hierarchy. But I wonder if that's partly the force of the modernism in Breuer's building, is to create a kind of an open field where those pictures are really vying for.
That's one thing I don't really understand, but actually I think you were talking about and Jared was talking about is the incredible dissonance of those pictures and that architecture, but it's not a dissonance. I mean, it's really like shaking hands across the centuries.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I really felt. I mean, I'm like all New Yorkers. I'm a born and bred New Yorker. Like all New Yorkers, I love that building. I mean, there's something about. I grew up going to see shows there. The little Charles Simmons in the stairwell.
I hated it, but because I was a young malcontent who hated everything, and but it wore me down. I mean, it's a wonderful building.
Can we talk about that for a second? How you changed from a young malcontent to, because one of the things that's really evident in your writing is there. I always find in your writing multiple levels of pleasure. You're having an enormous amount of pleasure with the art. You're having an enormous amount of pleasure with your own mind figuring out what you think about the art.
Yeah.
And then there are certain sentences, like writer to writer, I'm like, I know he felt really good about that sentence. So you're someone who lets the pleasure of your experience show.
Well, the way I explain what, grew up in the Midwest, dropped out of college, was always a poet. I never took an art course. I came to New York, worked as a journalist, fell into the poetry world, which fell into the art world.
Right.
There's wild times, and I started writing art criticism in almost perfect ignorance, but people liked how I did it, so they kept asking me, and little by little I got self-educated, which is a very painful way to learn, but you remember all the lessons.
What's one of the lessons you remember about, like, I mean, it's a pedestrian way to ask, but what's one of the lessons you learned where you're like, oh shit, I really got that wrong?
Well, I think at first, because I knew the poets, who knew the abstract expressionists, and Mozart Kuning, who I believe is God, still to this day, but I think I was sort of over the top in support of painters who weren't terribly good, and I was I don't know how quickly I caught on to minimalism, but I'm sure I was resistant at first, and sometimes if you're just in a really bad mood, and without even quite meaning to, you're mean to somebody, which is utterly pointless.
Right.
And, but that's less so. By the way, negative reviews are very bad for your character.
Yeah.
Because you can't write a negative review without showing off.
Oh, that's an interesting formulation. I never thought of that.
Yeah. It's about how clever you are.
You can't write a negative review without showing off. Yes, that is what one is doing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And,
I just thought about a negative review I wrote, and I was totally showing off.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, nobody's perfect.
Right.
But
I always thought that.
but I just fell into the. I mean, in New York in the '60s. I don't know. It was like it's totally a performance city. It's like nobody ever asked to see a diploma of mine.
Right.
Like, and I think I hope it's still sort of the case in New York. If you do something and somebody likes it, they're going to want you to do it again.
Right.
And pretty soon you're a professional. Also, I sort of worked through the poetry world and with a fair amount of disillusionment. And the art parties were so much better than the poetry parties, you wouldn't believe it.
It's funny. I say the same thing that in my senior year of college at UCSD, there were the poets and there were the artists, and the visual arts people threw the vastly better parties, and that's why I ended up where I am.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, I think it's all happenstance. I mean, it's like it was the great E.B. White essay about New York, where he said that the one qualification for coming to New York is a willingness to be lucky. And
So can I ask you, so New York and the art world for the second half of the 20th century, as we know, they're synonymous with one another. I mean, you can't talk about the art world and not talk about New York. And, that has eased. That gives way. And I'm curious in this moment, this post-pandemic moment, whatever this moment is that we're in, what are some of the things you are worried we might lose?
Well, I don't know. I think that things that are lost are probably due to be lost, and we'll get over it.
Right.
It's what's going to happen, and we're going through a year where we've been of universal isolation, where there are any number of tens or hundreds of thousands of young, creative people out there,
Right.
Who have been sitting on things. Sometimes I feel like I think about the situation that like I hear a fizzing as of Jesus, that there's got to be some kegs of dynamite around here that are going to go off.
Do you think the kegs of dynamite are going to go off in a good way or in a destructive way? I mean, that dynamite metaphor can go both ways.
Well, dynamite is used in a destructive way to make space for construction.
Yeah.
Or to blow up your best enemy.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I don't see any reason to not be optimistic.
You don't see any reason not to be optimistic?
Not to be optimistic. It's like, well, it's like,
I'm loving
no, I'm wrong. Okay, it's like, and I'm not expecting a whole lot. I mean, it's John Ashbery, the poet, said, once you discover that life can't be one continuous orgasm, you settle for pleasant surprises. And I'm looking forward, with hope to pleasant surprises. But if I am way high on the food chain, so
Right.
And in the later years of my career, so I'm not imagining that anybody is going to do something with a conscious intention to please me. I mean,
Right.
I hope to be around long enough to register changes and say things about them. But
And how would you narrate the changes that we've, I don't know whether it's sort of like where to drop the pin. Is it 9/11? Is it a Trump presidency? Is it the rise of a Black Lives Matter movement? All of these things have really changed.
Extremely dramatic. I think that, maybe with the difference of Black Lives Matter, I think that they seem to have less effect than you would have thought. They changed things less than you would have anticipated. Because who are artists? Artists are closeted narcissists who are interested in whose interest in art is confined to themselves.
I don't know. I think Black Lives Matter has changed so much, and
I think that had a
and it's founded by artists. Black Lives Matter was basically born of a group of artists.
Yeah. Well, it was. Yeah. Well, that I am making an exception of that.
Right.
It's a real cultural change. But 9/11 was just an utter shock, which we've never quite recovered from.
Yeah.
And what else did you mention?
That little matter of the Trump presidency.
Trump presidency, which is, oh gosh, what do you.
Is there anything we can say about it? It's just so numbing still.
It was horrible, but it's, well, okay, let's talk about, one thing about politics, like I know about politics, but, is the discovery that there is a substantial and growing and extremely energetic fascistic tendency.
Yes.
Around the world.
Around the world. Yeah.
And it's, I love Joe Biden. It's like, and he's seems to be, he's betting that there is a long-term appeal in things being rational and normal and good-hearted. We'll find out.
Right.
We'll find out. We don't know how many people out there are crazy.
Right.
And we'll have to have elections to find out.
Do you think, when you see that about this sort of rise of fascism worldwide, which of course I agree with you, I wonder, I feel both protected by my love of art in this moment, because I feel like,
well, I think we've got to look in the mirror and admit that we are the elite of the elite. Okay?
Yes.
And with all of the implications the elite has, some of which are highly negative.
Right.
And the sense of being right, politically, the sense of being correct aesthetically, is like, it's poisonous. It's self-destructive.
Right.
And we were quoting this great Franz Klein quote. Which was probably ad-libbed by Frank O'Hara. But to be right is the most terrific personal state that nobody is interested in.
Right.
And it's because it seems to me, as if you're involved in art, you have an interest in maintaining a certain vulnerability.
Right.
Where you're vulnerable to experience, you're vulnerable to being confronted with something that you immediately hate.
Right.
Which, by the way, something immediately you hate, it's an absolutely authentic human response.
Right.
I'd advise people thinking, great, stick around, have another first impression. It's because our first reaction to anything new is resistance, because it's threatening our stability, and then relax a little, let the stability develop.
Yeah, I've throughout my whole professional life in the art world, I've always tried to counter that antipathy that can happen in the face of new things. People just writing it off, not liking it right away.
I'm sympathetic to that. I mean, I sympathize with them.
You sympathize. I kind of like that moment of not knowing, though. I sort of love being confronted with something I don't understand.
I mean, we're addicts.
I am an addict. It's true.
And, and talking to the regular people is, I mean, you got to shift down a gear and realize that you're I'm a regular person too. But that had to do with also how I came into the art world as a ignorant amateur,
right?
And so I always said, and I say I was a malcontent. I was, anti anything that was an institution, whatever. I mean, it was, but also it has to do with. I think I'm somewhat of an artist, and and that the typical stage for a very young artist is to arrive in the world and fly into a rage at discovering that nobody has been waiting for him. Okay, it's like they don't know who he or she is. And it's like,
right.
And boy, that pisses you off,
right?
And you try to. Strategize something that's going to stick it to those people.
Right.
And so that was, this was it was standard adolescent,
I'm so, it's time for us to go to some questions from the folks who are listening to us and watching us out online. But I have like one more kind of goofy question, and I'm a little embarrassed to ask it, but I do want to ask it because, you are, and I mean this in the most honorific way, you are an elder statesman, you are an octogenarian, you have, this is so not your first rodeo. And I wonder if there's just a few, bon mot, a few good words you can give us about what it means, to be in this art world life for this long. Like, what has changed for you internally, personally, what
generous contract from the New Yorker.
A generous contract from the New Yorker. It's true. You do have the job everybody wants. It is ridiculous.
It's embarrassing. People... I think there'll be a national celebration when I'm gone.
No, I don't think so. I think there'll be a national.
I remember when I was, young, in the 60s, 70s. It's like, I almost prayed for Harold Rosenberg to die, and when he did, I felt weird. But
right.
It's.
But is there?
But it also, it's. The anger, I don't know. It's like it gets without the whole anger. It gets a little harder for me to concentrate.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you miss the old anger a little?
Well, not. Yes, no. It's
an engine.
It's an engine, and I would write these sort of horrible comes and then know enough to, and with the help of the editor, tune them down and made them sane.
Right.
It's there are many opportunities for going insane in and around art, and some of them are more fun than others.
Okay, there are. Oh my goodness, there are absolutely so many questions. Okay, I'm going for it. Have you seen the Alice Neal show at the Met?
I have not seen that show.
Okay,
but I am a huge Alice Neal fan.
You are a huge Alice Neal.
And I think, by the way, it's interesting. When I was talking to Jared about it, the phenomenon of Alice Neal coming out of absolutely nowhere to be, the people's favorite is, that's a cultural change.
What do you think that cultural change is about?
Well, I think it's about well, I can see the effects of it is like another nail in the coffin of formalism. It's like, what do you want, an Alice Neal or Kenneth Noland?
Right.
It's not a close call.
Right. It's clear. No, it's really it's interesting. Okay. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, I always love this kind of question. What are you reading now, either for solace or for pleasure?
Oh, let's see. I just read detective novels, and by the way, one of my all-time writer heroes is Raymond Chandler.
Yeah.
Which by the way, in terms of snappy lines.
Yeah.
He's
the master.
He's the guru. Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, I just reread Fathers and Sons by Turgenev. And which I read when I was young, and I hated it then, and I still do.
Is there a picture you hated when you were young but don't hate anymore?
Oh boy, probably.
Yeah.
Probably. I would have to.
It's one of the greatest things about art is that you get to, have the 20-year-old version of Manet, the 30-year-old version of your relationship to Manet.
Absolutely.
Well,
I had. I had the usual story with Rembrandt. I was close to 40 before it went.
Right before you got it.
Yeah, and it got me. And
right.
I had to have lived enough.
Right.
To absolutely believe what I was saying. And
it's something I feel that way sometimes. Sometimes I think we get the art we're ready for, we get the art we deserve.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're just not old enough to get it yet.
Yeah, sure. Or we have some kind of twist in us, but it's the art stays the same, but the experience of it is different every time, and it is like a way of tracking yourself through life, and also doing it in semi-public, doing it in one of the. For visual art is like the one art that doesn't subsist economically on the sales of tickets or copies.
Right.
It's unique objects, and anyway.
All right. Another question is: have you thought at all about the NFT situation?
The NFT, a little, yeah. I think it deeply silly, but it's part of the logic of the constant invention of new financial instruments.
Right.
It's like you can make money off of money by
right.
derivatives and and this is kind of the ultimate derivative, because it's like
right.
It's only about money.
Right.
It's about money that's theoretically parked somewhere in the universe.
Right.
And
it makes sense to me that it dovetails with our world, the art world, because we're a world, we create enormous amounts of value.
Yeah.
And we're not quite sure how we do it, and no one's quite sure how to regulate the value we create.
The market does it, the market, which includes galleries, by the way, and so it is like involved in the business of alchemically transforming value into price.
Right.
And by the way, here we are in a gallery, which is David Zwirner, and boy, I sure don't want to bite the hand, but it's part of David's project. It's part of a kind of a little hybrid,
Yeah.
commerce class institutions,
Right.
which have a possible lot of dynamism in them, and but also a lot to think about and a lot to
I think so. And I think museums are also increasingly hybrid too, perhaps without knowing it, right? Because they've established on a not-for-profit model.
Yeah.
However, the new philanthropy models are extraordinarily transactional. And the idea of that the culture has that if you're rich, you must be smart.
Yeah.
It's not always true.
If you're not rich, try to prove that you're smart.
Right.
It's I'm going to say something that's going to be, some people are going to hate. I don't mind deaccessioning.
You don't mind deaccessioning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So museums just like, as long as they don't burn the artwork. I mean, it's always going to be somewhere. And it'll probably end up in another institution, in an institution that is just chronically broke and happens to have a couple of things that are really valuable. I just do not see the felony. And
even if the stuff is sold to pay the bills and not buy other art? I mean, the current rule is you can sell it to buy more work, but you can't sell it to pay the heat.
No, I know. That just seems frustrating. I mean, it's like, it just seems like the world is bigger and more complex, and and ethical situations are never black and white.
Right.
But that's I just get. I think my orneriness comes back whenever anyone is being moralistic about anything.
Right.
It's like I'll take the bad guy's life.
Yeah. I am I'm on record as being against deaccessioning to pay the bills. I think it's the trustee's job to pay the bills.
That's pretty much the consensus from our institution. So but and I'm not entering into arguing about it. So.
But I've grown more open to the fact that that the museum is not a sacrosanct place. The museum is an ethically challenged place like all the other places. It doesn't have any special purchase on...
well, it's like the little Bo Peep jury of saying it's just not going to have a future. I mean, well.
So we are in our wind down phase. I have a few things I want to say to you. Okay. One, you're wearing Met sneakers.
Yeah.
And
these are gifts from my son-in-law.
The structure of being a Mets fan and being an art lover are the same. You got to believe.
Yeah.
And I really, I love that the preeminent art critic of our time is wearing Mets sneakers.
Yeah. Well, it goes way back.
Yep.
It was, me and Brooke, and also how to endure seasons of just horrible shit.
Horrible. Right. And then every once in a while, there's 1986, man. And something really something pops.
Oh, gosh, I remember the nights. Anyway, the whole city just went out.
The whole city. And the other thing I want to say is you are the Mark Twain of our time. The rumors of your demise or your death are highly overrated.
Yeah.
About which I am very pleased.
That was embarrassing.
You shouldn't.
No. Yeah, I was given 6 months to live, during which I became, incredibly absorbed, and I wrote a piece in the New Yorker about dying.
Yeah.
That a lot of people seem to like.
It was amazing.
And then had immunotherapy, which the doctor had given a 35% chance of helping. And I was like, 35% in Vegas, you're broke within an hour. Okay. In baseball, you're in the Hall of Fame.
There you go.
But it just took. So.
Well, this brings us full circle then, because you are in the Hall of Fame in baseball, in art criticism, and it's been just It's been great, and I am so happy to have had this opportunity to talk with you, and want to thank you for coming out and coming to New York and engaging in this this little experiment that we're doing here.
I was so pleased to be invited.
And you give me I'm gonna tack to your sense of optimism and hope.
Yeah, well, why not? It's like, what's the worst thing that can happen?
Exactly. The worst thing that could happen is that we could be disappointed, and that's just a given anyway.
Yeah, and then when our dog is going to say, by God, what's it
What's it all about?